BC. Um, I'm going to read a little bit to you about what I asked this incredible panel to talk about. And I'm actually not going to read their bios, not going to introduce them. I have Rinaldo Walcott sitting next to me. Next to him is Susan Crean, and then at the far end is Daniel David Moses. These are all artists, critics, reviewers, thinkers, theorists that have been working for as long as I've known on these critical issues in various ways. I've had the delight of being able to interact with them in many different ways, seeing them speak, working with them, inviting them in, and so it's a real pleasure to have them here. I'm going to reference a couple of them as I do my little intro spiel, because I think it's been important how they've woven themselves into the fabric of this discussion. So with that, I'd like to start. I would like to acknowledge the territory we're on. Indeed, the indigenous territories we're always on when we're working across this nation. And that will come into play when I finish off my little spiel. And of course to thank Samaro, Larissa, and Roy for all the work they've done to pull this together. One thing we did discuss was it is a shame we don't get to know all of you, and because we had to change venues, we don't have the chance for milling about and talking as we would like to. So I hope we have an opportunity to have further conversations after the end of this session, at the end of our next, to further discuss this. I know it's difficult, and I hope to move against some of the hierarchical traditions that the Academy often gives to us. So let me read to you really briefly then what I wrote to our panel and how I thought we could set this up. I mentioned to them that when I was asked to facilitate this panel, I saw that as being quite full, and because it's the penultimate session of the one-day event, and what's following us will be a response session, we effectively are rounding out the day. So I'm looking forward to see what these folks will have to say about this. I'm reading the title here of this panel as a lens on the future, as it were. The previous panels and sessions have covered the history and trajectory of the past 20 years, and will no doubt point to many of the issues that are going to be raised here as we discuss things today, and we'll hopefully be able to illuminate them a bit further and from the conversations from the floor as well. We have, as I said, an incredible wealth of experience in our panel. And I think it behooves us to exploit that by articulating, however briefly, how our own work and community engagement has transmogrified over these past 2 decades. I don't think this is necessarily going to project any form of self-indulgence here, because what we have to say about our various pathways is essentially inclusive of the many over the few. And knowing this panel, that's exactly what has happened. It's always been the many over the few. So to that end, I'm setting the tone of this, perhaps, uneasy alliance of activism and creative labor, which has been pointed out at various points of the day, touching on how the volatile 1990s, not just the Writing Through Race conference, of course, but movements that have been talked about here. I'm thinking particularly of things like the Mingkwan Panchayat. I think of my dear friend Shirley Bair and all she did, and all the work the groundwork she did that let me learn from her and so many others here, that have groomed the ground for where we're situated today. And it is a grooming. It is a situation of where we're at today. So I hope our group here can use the historical situating as a springboard of sorts, so we can spend some time talking about where we are now and where we are headed. So although necessarily when we have these historical critiques, there's a sense of clouds on the horizon, I'm hoping we can see how we can maneuver through those clouds and do something that is really, really necessary. As we've talked a little bit about hope and optimism here, I hope we can actually turn that into some really progressive and positive change. It's very easy to look at our current government and look at our current world situation and say it's impossible. I'm looking for those moments of possibility here. I'm particularly interested in how movements forged today are activating communities in ways we may have not anticipated. We've already talked a bit about Idle No More, a surfeit of artistic and critical responses to events like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. David Garneau, who was here earlier, is actually just across the way with Peter Morin and Cheryl Larondel and all sorts of others talking about Indigenous activism in the Artistic Academy. And there's a variety of cross-community disciplinary articulations. And finally, I think it might be rewarding to touch on how creative labor inside and outside the academy mirror each other or not, and what that means for contemporary cultural economies. And talking to Cecily earlier, we're talking about that frustration that often happens when we do see this separation of those two very, very vibrant areas. So that's my take on what we can bring into the space. Like I said, I'm not going to introduce the panelists by their particular works. They can do that if they choose, but I think it's more interesting here to have a discussion and a favor instead an overarching reflection of what we can bring to the table. So I suggest that we attempt to move from a series of monologic maunderings to some energetic crosstalk, if we can. And giving the players across the table, I think that's quite possible. Now, let me start by, I know one of the things we talked about here was not to create a simple analog of historical moments, but I want to tell about one moment which has been referenced a bit, and because I think it does show a movement into a potential future. People have mentioned the pulling of the funding from Michel Dupuis, Minister of Heritage, and the pressure that came from the Reform Party at the time. Now, the pressure came from the critic from the Reform Party, Jan Brown. Now, this is a story I've told before, and I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. At the time, we were doing a series of writers' workshops in the Crow's Nest Pass in Alberta, and I lived in Calgary. And while Jan Brown was not my MP, she was the MP from the riding right over. And as soon as this had happened, I remember it was Fred Waugh calling us and telling us that the money's been pulled. A lot of us got very upset. We're there in southern Alberta. We're very upset about where things are going, and we wanted to do something about it. And so I thought, I was really, really angry, and I thought what I'm going to do is call up her office, and I'm going to start yelling at whoever answers the phone. And I was going to say, I'm going to insist on speaking to Jan Brown no matter what happens, right? And she's going to have to call me back. So I call up, right? And instead of someone answering the phone saying, this is Jan Brown's constituency office, I just got, hello? And I thought, hello, I want to speak to Jan Brown. I said, and she said, this is her, I'm here. I thought, oh my God, the MP is answering her own phone. So I told her who I was, how I wasn't in her particular riding. The riding that my father lived in was actually Preston Manning's riding, and he's an elder statesman, and he said to me once, he said, I don't think that Preston Manning likes immigrants very much, right? That was his attempt to talk about his politics. So I talked to Jan and I said it was completely irresponsible for you to go after the minister like this, the heritage minister, and to have this funding pulled. And she kept going on about this being a racist conference. But she said, you know, I'm a writer too, and I just don't want public money being spent on this racist conference. If it's privately funded money, that's fine, right? And I thought about this for a second, and like a good activist, I thought, well, how can I lie my way through this? And so I said to her, okay, I'm going to put up $1,000 for this conference. If you really believe that private money should fund this, why don't you put up $1,000 too? There's a certain pause that happens when you're talking to a politician but not quite sure what to say. Because she couldn't say to me no, because she just advised me to get private funding and that she would support this if I got private funding. And so I said, give me the $1,000, and she said, let me think about it. Right? And that's the moment I wanted to dwell on. Let me think about it. If you're going to call something a racist conference, you're going to say our government should not support it, and yet the private sector should. What does that mean about the integrity and the focus of your particular work? So it was a really acerbic moment, and I actually called her the next day and said, you know, you said you'd think about it. Have you thought about it? She said, yeah, I thought about it. I don't think I'm going to support this time around, right? But it was a very important moment, I think, to think about what was going on in the minds of the politicians. If you look at the history books now, you'll see that she and people like Jim Cilia, who were also the Reform Party, were actually considered the more moderates of the Reform Party. They're the ones that were resisting some of the homophobic and some of the other racist impulses coming from the Reform government at the time. What I wanted to say in response to that is how some of this stuff affected us and how it got us to think forward really moved us in a number of different ways. And one of the things that Writing Through Race did, I think, for me, was to understand the larger context of racialization in this particular nation state and the connections to land. You know, I realized after that time that I'd lived on Mi'kmaq territory, that I'd lived on Stoney, and I taught on Siksika territory. My first teaching gig was at a former residential school that was now a community outreach place on the Blackfoot Nation. I lived at down the road from Tsuut'ina Nation. I then moved out to Coast Salish territory, and then now I'm in Interior Salish and first in Secwepemc land and now in the Okanagan territory. Always moving across indigenous lands. And I thought, as a racialized subject, I have to be very conscious of that, perhaps more conscious because of my particular role and interplay on this. And so currently in the role that I'm in at UBC, and this is that moment of creative activism, I think, is coming in as a head to a department like that, which is already very fired up around promoting indigenous practice and presence, is to emulate that and to keep working on that, to make sure the hires happen inside the academy, because they do mirror what's happening outside the academy, to create an understanding for the students, both undergraduate and graduate, to understand the Okanagan Nation that they're on, because that's equally important to simply looking in the history books to see how the nation state itself was formed. So the very presence, the very teachings of the land itself. We're very fortunate to have someone like Jindan Armstrong, who is a Canada Research Chair. She's just in our territory and teaching with us there. So we're able to do this stuff. So these are some of the lessons I think I've taken forward and brought into that space from a community activist space, a long space from calling up an MP and yelling at her, but being able to try and make that difference inside a particular zone for future generations. So with that rambling introduction, I'm going to turn it over to our eminent panel here and see what they have to say about these ideas of creative activism. So whoever would like to start, jump on in. I did give them the option before choosing a selection process, but no.
But I'm only going to do one to start with. And that is to talk about activism, and we're talking about activism and our creative process or our creative life. And I think it's to go back to some of the origins of how this kind of work, how something like Writing Through Race got started and happened. So I'll give you my personal thing. I'm sure everybody who was involved with it had a kind of a personal moment too. So this was before it happened. It was even before the first conference happened, and the first conference being the appropriate voice. And it goes back to a previous year or two in the Writers' Union of Canada, where the issues were brought up by Daniel and Lenore and brought to an annual meeting with the idea that we set up a committee to deal with the issues of writers of color. And there was a conversation about it, and a person got up and made the impassioned speech about the fact that we really didn't know very much about what we were talking about, and the entire room was given permission to vote against it, which they did. Because a lot of people hadn't been brought along in this discussion. I'm not talking about people who are necessarily white or necessarily not white, but the fact was the union wasn't ready for it. But how do you get a union ready for it? You give them Writing Through Race. That's how you make them ready for it. So the fact is, we then had to go and do some research, which was done. And Lenore, I think you were part of that committee for about a year. And we went back and we set up a committee. By this time, I had been elected chair of the union. This was about 1991. So here's the personal part of it. My good friend Lillian Allen over there. This is talking about how you make coalitions. Coalitions happen between groups of people, but in that is also personal stuff. So this is where you get into the personal and the political sometimes are the same thing. So because of my relationship and working with Lillian and other things, I was talking about what we were leading up to in the Writers' Union. She says, you know, sometimes you just had to break the cookie jar. So that's still in my head about breaking cookie jars. And I'm thinking about what kind of cookies are there in that cookie jar. But it just meant you got to break some rules. So year I was chair, this was all beginning to come. We had a committee, so I broke the cookie jar and said, okay, that committee is going to meet at the same time the National Council said that. So we found the money for them to meet at the same time we met. And at the same time, it was clear that while there had been some understanding within the First Nations community of writers, we didn't know about other groups, about other racial minorities. So the thing that Lillian did on a completely informal basis was to provide Lenore and I with a group of people in the Toronto community, artists of color from her community to meet with, and we did this. Lenore, I can remember some of the names. Ayanna Black. I remembered somebody the other day whose name I couldn't remember. Raymond Watts, is that? a name. If I got it right, maybe I don't. But in any case, there were people that were active that we didn't know personally. So how is a union that represents writers across the country that does not have a lot of these people in the community, how do you get to the point where they are? Why should they bring their politics to our largely white union if they have to do a battle before they get in the door? That's what was going on, and that's what we had to find a way to work around, and we did. But that meant that there were going to be a lot of people that we were going to be taking on within the union because they became articulate at a certain point where they'd never been articulate before. Some of them we deeply suspected were members of the union waiting for this to happen or something so they could write columns in Saturday Night Magazine, and we won't mention names. But that was important to do. It was important to hear what they had to say. It was important for me as a white person to hear. I'm really glad to hear that. I grew up in Forest Hill in Toronto. I knew about anti-Semitism as a kid growing up. You got to hear it in those days. Then you went through a period where you don't hear it anymore. We have to believe that these things can sometimes grow and change, but we can't be Pollyanna-ish about it. And there is this whole business about racism going underground and dealing with it by simply mentioning the fact that the bad bits happen and then you don't mention them ever again. So I just want to make the point about the importance of personal, about people you know well enough who you can trust their opinion. The other thing I wanted to say in terms of the person who was making a comment, the Eastern European woman, I don't know if she's here, but it is to say, if you're going to do cross-cultural work, you have to expect to bump into the furniture. If you don't, you're not doing it right. You have to deal with that. You have to go through it, and it's not the worst thing in the world. That's all I'm going to say about that. So I'd like to pass it on.
Fuck off, June Caldwell says to M. Norbesi Phillip in 1997 at the Penn conference. And that fuck off still echoes. So I begin there because in the last panel and earlier, the question of the archive came up. And the way in which the archive was discussed, it went towards the question of the Foucauldian archive. But I want to take us in another direction of the archive, which is the Derridian archive. And the archive that fails us, that we go there looking for something that we can never find because it's always in advance of us. And I would say as we think about writing to erase 20 years later, and we think about it in relationship to black peoples, because I refuse the term people of color, I think that it obfuscates the very real kinds of things that are coming down on black people's lives in the nation state of Canada and beyond. So I want to hold that in suspension as a way to say that 20 years later, the politics of coalition has failed black people collectively in this space. And in a way, the politics of coalition has become, for black people, a kind of fuck off. And I can say this whether or not we're looking at the major art institutions in this country, whether or not we're looking at major institutions like universities, whether we're looking at governments, and whether we're looking at the ways in which people are currently organizing politics to impact and to find their own place within the logics of this colonial settler state. And so, for me, part of what I want us to grapple with is what does it mean to, on the one hand, claim to invoke a certain kind of indigenousness by naming lands and territories and so forth, and then to produce arguments that are about finding places within this nation state, that are about reforming this nation state. A nation state that cannot be reformed because its very foundation is founded in inequality and violence. So what exactly are we asking for 20 years later? And when I bring the lens of that question, what are we asking for 20 years later, to the question of black people and black people's lives, all I can see is that we're in a particular historical moment where the question of coalition cannot work for black people. In fact, black people have been consistently betrayed by the politics of coalition. I see it in my university, I see it in major art institutions, I see it in the public education system, I see it everywhere, our betrayal. And quite often that betrayal is quite frankly mediated by the language of POC, where the language of POC comes to excise black people as a particular kind of constituency that might bring a particular kind of history to bear that really shows up the limits of the nation state that really deeply problematizes capitalism and any kind of discourse that seeks to reform it as a place within which we can find some form of life. So I'll use those as my opening comments, and then I'll say more and more things about that's the way I'm thinking these days.
Been an interesting day for me because I realized as the day went on and people have been sharing their memories of the event that I had very few memories of it. That I knew I'd been there, and I knew I'd had a really stimulating time because I got to talk with a lot of other people about what they were working on and what they were interested in working on, and how they. It felt like a community to me. And that was important because, as Lenore mentioned, I had joined the Writers' Union because I just wanted to know what was going on. I grew up on the Six Nations Reserve, and I had no idea what a union of writers might be about, but it sounded like it might be useful, so that's why I joined. But yeah, I did feel lonely because there was something, and it still feels this way to me, there was something perverse about the mythology of the union because they kept quoting Margaret Lawrence about writers being a tribe, and I just thought that was kind of hippy-dippy bullshit somehow or other, and I still think it sort of obfuscates something or other. I think the only point I'm remembering of the conference was that there was one session about sexuality, and actually it was the gay caucus. Gay people were still off in a corner at that point, but I mean that's sort of a big change now because gay doesn't seem to be an issue anymore. At least my senior playwriting class, like 2/3 of it are gay men, which like when I first started teaching a decade ago, that would have not been possible at all. So I think there's that change that's been going on in the broader culture, but it still is an event when I get a black student. I've got other minorities happening. I've got an Arab and a Chinese, but we still at Queen's we still don't get that many black people into the creative arts part of the university, which would be once again a feeling of community for me, because that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that arts community, because when you're teaching the stuff, it's different from actually being a maker of the stuff, like I was when I was here full time in the city and making plays with Native Earth, and I mean, in the last year for me, one of the highlights was one of our younger playwrights, Tara Bagan. She was so shy about this, asking me if I would be a dramaturge for her. And I just thought, oh, great, I get to be in rehearsal again, even if it's not my own play. There's such joy in the actual work. I would have done it for nothing, but she paid me well. It's for me, I always want to come back to ways to strategize, to get the funding, to make the work, because it's the work that talks about human nature, about justice, about just interesting stories, the stories of our broader lives that are important to me. One of the joys of working at Queen's is my department finally saw that I had all this knowledge about First Nations playwrights in the country, and they allowed me to teach a course in it. And it's one of the students' favorite courses just because they said to me, why didn't we know this stuff before? No one told us this was going on. And then on top of it, it's of course the best work by these playwrights. So it's not only new stories, it's exquisitely rendered stories, and it allows them to see a vital theatrical culture that's growing despite limited funding, despite limited attention. But I don't know. I've never claimed to be an activist. I'm sort of an accidental activist. It's like I'm there to be dragged into it if necessary. But I mean, I grew up on the Six Nations Reserve, and I didn't know what racism was about until I came to university, because our community is so darn big. I mean, if there's racism happening there, it's maybe the behind the hand discussions we have about the white people who've married into our families. You know, Aunt Jane doesn't quite understand the right way to behave, but we'll shut her down and help her understand that her behavior is not the way things are done here. Although that's more about culture than race, really, because, I mean, she still was Aunt Jane. I really like to emphasize culture as opposed to race. We know that's the bugaboo. That's the lie. I've gone all over the place, but that's probably as much as I can say at the moment.
If I walked into a lecture hall like this at York University, where I began my teaching career 20 years ago, it would be indeed 90% of the students in that lecture hall would have been black. Today, if I walk into a similar lecture hall, that's not the case. The populations haven't changed. In fact, they've grown, they've become bigger. So what I'm trying to say is that there's something about the ways in which we talk about race in this country that displaces and makes disappeared black people. And part of what I think has to be the legacy of thinking about this conference is how we bring black people into the conversation, not as compensation, not as supplement, but as a part of what was vital to the initial forms of coalition that happened. The ways in which these stories and histories are being written are also working to make black people disappear. So what I'm saying is that there's substantial evidence to see the ways in which how we're organizing, how we're invoking who we think or what we think is at stake for the contemporary Canadian nation state is eliding the lives of black people. And it's a significant issue, and it's one that I have shifted my work from. My work began by thinking about Canadian multiculturalism and its possibilities and impossibilities. I'm no longer interested in that line or flight of thought at all anymore. I'm only now interested in the ways in which a whole series of practices, many of them going on under the moniker of progressive, continue to engage in forms of anti-blackness that continue to place black people in compensatory positions, in positions where we are forced to only react from forms of anger, and yet, nonetheless, so much of that work is premised on contributions that black people have made in terms of thinking, critical engagement with the limits of modernity and so on. So one of the things that we need to begin to think about is how to make that work resurface in a way that it has a significant and material impact on black people's lives.
Okay, thanks to all of you. I want to move very quickly to the floor so we can have more room for critical engagement. But before we get to that, I think Rinaldo's picked up a bit on this, is I started off the conversation by saying, I look at activism in a way, it's often a response to a problematic state or problematic situation, and it doesn't seem to have a lot of positive elements to it. Creative labor seems to insinuate that there is a potential for something, some sort of growth and some sort of change. Daniel, you mentioned a change of politics of sexuality that somehow was allowed for something different that you saw than was before. But Rinaldo's point, of course, is that he's not seeing that. So I wonder if the three of you could talk briefly before we go to the floor about that glimmer of potential, that glimmer of hope that creative labor can do. And if you're not seeing it, what, as is clear from what I think Rinaldo was saying, what shift needs to happen, or what shift can we embody or enact to take us to that place? What lessons from the past can we learn to actually make these changes that we talk about, instead of being in a place where we're saying it's not going to happen? So is there any thoughts on that before we go to the floor?
I'm not sure if I can make something out of this, but what occurs to me is there's a play called Farewell by Ian Ross that won the GG one year, and it's about people waiting for their welfare checks on an impoverished reserve. But one of the things the students always focus on in that play is that one of the characters is nicknamed Nigger. And I mean, basically this, I mean, if you've seen some of the people out west, they're dark people. So it sort of is a comic tip of the hat to a culture that really is just like immediate information for the characters in the play. But the students are hesitant to talk about it. That's one of the words that can't be said. That's the N word, and I'm wondering if that isn't just part of the. It's a topic so explosive that people just are scared to even engage. And it's like, if you can't actually articulate a topic, a problem, it doesn't become real for them. So that they just, I think there's a lack of intellectual, emotional engagement with it, and I think it's an issue more generally with mainstream culture, because I mean, my other Aboriginal friends and I always joke that we go to a movie or a play about Aboriginal people, and we know if there's laughter in the audience, there are other Aboriginal people there. But it's like the mainstream audience is afraid to laugh. It's like there's a lack of commitment to their own human responses. So I just think, we've got to learn how to talk about it.
When we had writing through race, what we heard was from a silent white majority. And it's also true that we were talking through the media in a way that I don't think these controversies today would be served up. It was very unnerving at a certain level with not only this one, but there had been a previous, I'm trying to locate exactly the date of it, but I think it was mentioned somewhere along, of a controversy with the women's press, where a collection of short stories was halted partway through because of concerns about voice appropriation, and that came up as a major, I think it was before writing, before. Wasn't? Before. Yes, okay, thank you. And so this was also part of the context. It was a discussion that people didn't understand at all, and almost perversely misinterpret. But the problem with that one was that the people involved on, as it were, both sides, and it wasn't always clear if they were opposite sides. But this was done through the pages of the Globe and Mail and the CBC. And in some way, I'm glad about the atomization of the media, because that's hard to do. That's hard for everybody, because you figure, if you're the opposition, who are you speaking for at that point? Is it the writers' union? Is it at your community and stuff like that and things? So in that sense, I think we've got more nuanced. But anything I have to say about this, I think in some ways we've moved forward and we've moved backwards. And I think it's clear from other comments that some things have worked and some things have dreadfully not worked. It's quite clear to me, and I guess it took me a long time to see that you do an act here, and some perverse thing about humans is that you think it's going to go in the direction you can see. It almost never goes in the direction you can see. So the other thing that we haven't talked about here today, I don't know that it matters very much, was, did this even transform the writers' union? It didn't. And in fact, I think I've been more not having thought. I mean, in some senses, I was quite amazed by the preamble to this conference. I said, really? People noticed. In the long term, I do expect this to be part of Canadian cultural history, because in fact, there was some writing about it by Francis Henry and, is it Carol Tater? And there's one other person, and they interviewed a lot of people, so there is some of that history. I'm rambling too. I think it's okay, we're allowed to ramble. Because the other thing that is going through my mind is, how do we actually capture this history? Sonnet, where are you? We had something of a discussion about this. Because if I have to think in the sort of my stereotyped idea about what academics are, they're not people well placed to do this. That is, you have to get at the history that you get from people by talking to them, which isn't a very well-respected part of what academics do very often, especially. But you have to do it. So I'm saying, what about the practices there? About when you are writing, how much distance do you have to have as an academic writing? When can you reintroduce what really is happening? So I think that talking about your creative response to activism in my own life, they're very related, because what I learn about in my activism often turns up in what I write. Sometimes I write stuff I could never, ever, ever have done if I hadn't done that activism. I'm a nonfiction writer. I don't know what fiction writers do, but I think a lot of it gets in there too. So let me just say one other sort of positive thing, and in a way I'm a little hesitant to do it, because there are things, beautiful things, that sometimes come to you because of racism. It's sometimes very hard to deal with, and I'm in the position of having somebody delivered to me in my life because of racism, and he was a head taxpayer, and I decided that I want to get this person, whose name was Wong Dong Wong, into a book about Toronto. I figured that was big enough. I could sort of slip him in there. I had no idea if I could research this life of somebody who came to this country in 1911 from Taishan and lived here until he died in 1970, and as far as I know, never went home. Never married, never had children. How do I access that from standing still, looking as I do without any Chinese? I did it. I just started, and then I discovered something quite amazing, that there were a lot of people there who were willing to be part of my journey to find him. One of them sitting right back there looking at her. That's Joanna Chow, and she has been my translator, my advisor, and has followed me the whole way, and she actually broke the whole story open. I found Mr. Wong, I found his story, I found descendants, I put his life together, and 20 years ago I would never have even tried, because of issues of voice appropriation, and I don't take back my thoughts at that time or where I was at that time, but I think we have changed in some ways that would allow me to do that. You'll read the book maybe, you'll tell me is it okay? I still don't entirely know it's okay, but who else was going to write his story? And I think I should stop there, but I think these things are very deep. And there are many of us who have crossed these lines of culture and of race in many, many different ways. And I do know that it's worth the candle, whatever happens. Thank you.
So I guess, so for me, the kinds of ways in which we sometimes talk about the nation state as though the possibility of some kind of reform can open up some space for a life that is lived differently than it is now, it's not a place that I can go. So I would say to Susan that in answering your question, I don't think the question there for me is one of appropriation. What I would say is, is it a story that has to be written? And I know that might seem a little bit outrageous, but what I'm trying to get at is that the story that needs to be written gets written at the time that it needs to be written. That we don't have to go seek it out. We have to ask ourselves, what work do we want that story to do now? Is the work we want that story to do to make it appear that Canada can indeed be a benevolent place? A place that can hold these so-called multiple differences and therefore point to its somehow better side? Or do we want that story to work for something else? And for me, it's about answering those kinds of questions. So if in the 1990s, all of these forms of activism, Writing Through Race Conference, the implosion, Larissa, I would say what happened at AMPAC was an implosion. And an implosion that what emerged out of it was some young people of color coming into some of those magazine spaces. White art radicals also worked very hard to undermine them. At Borderlines, there are people here who were in the collective. We had difficult shouting debates about how to bring race into cultural studies in Canada. They were difficult, tears, people walking out of rooms. So to think about, but the question is always like, what are we doing that work for? What do we imagine might be possible? And so in all of that difficulty in the 1990s, there was indeed something that seemed possible. By the time we get to the 2000s, we see other kinds of dynamics coming into place. And we see that, those who can position themselves as far away from blackness as possible could in some ways share in part with the national project. The closer you get to blackness, the least you can share in that national project. But black folk always knew that. Even if we sometimes appeal to the state, that's a compromise appeal. That was not an appeal that we imagined would embrace us in any fundamental way. So there's that side of what I'm trying to get at. And yet there's the other side of which black people fully and forcefully engaged in the politics of remaking that in our historical moment is beginning to go missing. And we need to find ways to bring that back into the conversation quite forcefully. But we also have to find ways to look at our own complicity within the institutions that we move through. Because many of us, and now I speak to the people of color in the room, are deeply complicit with the normative practices of our institutions. Deeply complicit. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks to all three of you for...
I feel the need to respond to what Rinaldo has spoken about. Rinaldo, I'm sorry, I'm nervous. So I spent most of my adolescence in the States, so I'm speaking from a different context, and I'm still familiarizing myself as a new immigrant to Canada to this context. But I identify as South Asian, and it took me a while to really fully understand the ways in which that I didn't know I was complicit. And I fully think I am and my community is. And there is this idea of relating back to what George Eliot Clark was saying about the idea of us all living under a white supremacy state. And because we do, when we start to benefit, we don't realize how that's still happening under that state. So a lot of the work that's been written, at least in the States, and I have no idea if it applies to Canada, so somebody else will have to speak to this, is how the success of South Asians in the States has happened at the expense of other groups. And I think that needs to be recognized, and it's important because it affects us, as in all of us in different ways, but it's really important. So I just think it's important what you're saying, and it should be recognized. So.
I need to speak into the moment because I know the state cannot be reformed. the problem of coalitions for Black people and for our variations in terms of gender and sexuality and all these intersections, for lack, are experiencing is devastating in the context of culture and knowledge production, in the context of the institution of which I'm not the latter a part of, though here I am. But it's also affecting us in the activism and our relationship to movement. And so I do participate in a grounded community. I participate, for example, in activism in relationship to migrant justice, activism in relationship to housing, anti-gentrification, and so on. I mean, it's an everyday thing for many people. So I think it's a devastating moment, and I just wanted to, I don't know, speak in solidarity, but ask, like, if you've got a glimpse of what is our movement forward. And at a time when there is something blooming and it's powerful, and it's not, sorry, I'm totally talking directly to Rinaldo, but, and it's not confined to the American state. There is such fluidity, and those borders we know in so many ways are crossed. And maybe it's not, there's no patent answer or prescriptive answer, but I just wonder if you've got a glimmer of something past that point, yeah?
I'm an activist. I study these things, and I think about them, and I write about them, and I critique them, and I engage with them. But you know, Richard Eiton's really fantastic book, In Search of the Black Fantastic, is an excellent example of the ways in which an anti-imperialist global Black movement led or in part influenced by major African-American activists and so on, was in some ways made into a civil rights movement, of which we now know what that narrative is. So in fact, what we're living in this moment is the potentiality of yet another global Black movement. The question is, how will others who we might want to hold in affiliation or in solidarity follow or work with that kind of lead, as opposed to the logic and language of coalition that suggests narratives about racism and so on that are like a racism fits all. Because we know at the level of the state, we know at the very local level of the state, that a racism fits all leads to forms of Black erasure. So, you know, we'll take a POC vis-a-vis that Black person, because Black people are always substandard, never contributing, even though, you know, our poetry or music or theater and so on always changes form, produces new modes of thinking about how to live a life. So our products are valued, but the actual material physicality of our bodies are not.
Here, I'll bring the mic over there.
I'm a Cree woman, and I'm quite aware when I come into other people's territory, this being Mississauga territory, that the discussions that we have about territoriality and ownership are sometimes accidentally intertwined, and that when we're talking about land, I got this Canada Research Chair, and I started working with my people from Kelly Lake and the Lubicon Lake Nation, and I phrased the conversation in terms of a diaspora. And they schooled me and said, that land is in you. That land is in you no matter where you are. That land is in you, you're a part of it, and you take it with you. And that can't happen. And so my Canada Research Chair ends up not necessarily being about that. It becomes something transformative because of the people that I'm working with. I also note that when we come into other people's territories and we're talking about race, we often sort of shorthand a conversation about colonization. We often shorthand the notion of imperialism, and we often are talking in English instead of in the language of the Mississauga people, instead of the languages that are born within us as peoples who come to differing territories. But we don't acknowledge that. And the other thing that I think of while I'm listening today is that I don't go into a room where I don't think about my cousins, my sisters, my aunties, my grandmother, who are killed or who are missing by virtue of gender, by virtue of race, by virtue of people's perceptions of by perceptions of what we are and whom we are not and what we're not worthy of. And we should be talking about that when we're talking about writing about race and talking about race as well. I also wanted to talk directly to Daniel David Moses, the accidental activist, as he coined himself. Being able to actually look at Indigenous experience as normative, being able to read it in the work, and being able to look into the work that you've done, including in Almighty Voice, looking in the different acts and seeing ourselves reflected within it, and then also reflected within the notion of racialization in the minstrel show, and seeing that within that. None of that's accidental. And it's really important for those of us who grow up looking to find out that there is someone, or there are people out there who have an absolutely inherent understanding of where they come from, and it's just one thread amongst thousands of threads that make up who you are as a member of your community, was really exceptionally important for a lot of us. So I thank you for that.